right. I'd like to follow up with a question that explores the link between what you just framed, the security sustainability nexus, and the concept of green capitalism that you introduce in your forthcoming book and that you define in two ways. So on the one hand, it refers to economic sectors and supply chains that are labeled green for their proven or unproven role in addressing the climate crisis through decarbonization or adaptation. And on the other, it represents a technocratic project driven by profit-maximizing firms and business-friendly governments that seek to foster market-driven innovation through de-risked investment. But as you argue, green capitalism is full of contradictions, and I'd like you to expand on some of these tensions. So how does, for example, the onshoring of extractive industries that you just mentioned in the core both contradict and reinforce patterns of unequal exchange in the periphery? And to what extent does national security clash or align with interests of transnational capital? Is green capital ultimately constrained by low or unstable profitability, as for example the economist Brad Christophers has argued? And finally, how do these multiple contradictions, so between rival states, between state and capital, and also among competing capital fractions, interact and shape one another?
Yeah, I think it's another moment where I think that the end of the last question really, pivots us to this one, right? Because I want to recall that what you mentioned about this idea that capitalism can internalize its own ecological and including climate contradictions through market mechanisms. That is one way to define green capitalism, right? From a more normative, what I mean is a non-critical, a normative perspective, almost like a promotional or booster perspective. Like if I asked someone who is a proponent of the idea that capitalism can internalize its own ecological contradictions, they would kind of call that end state green capitalism, right? And so that's one way to define green capitalism. Another way to define it is polar opposite, and it's in a kind of polarized debate with that first way, right? The second way is critical, and it says, all green capitalism is the greenwashing of capitalism, because capitalism can never internalize its ecological contradictions. So any claim that it can, or any attempt to implement market mechanisms to encourage it to do so, merely kind of like puts a green veil on a fundamentally ecologically unsustainable system, right? And, while I definitely see a virtue or some important critical traction that second, more critical definition of green capitalism gives us, I almost feel it's like too intertwined with this like debate with the boosters of green capital. So I want to kind of step away, not in this fake, like I'm above the fray of these political disagreements, but just to kind of start more empirically. Like, if we had to observe green capitalism beyond just greenwashing discourses, like, what is it? Like, what does it refer to? And for me, in this moment at least, and I think I'm offering a historically circumscribed definition, not like a trans-historical one, but in this moment, of maybe energy transition that's really better thought as energy addition, in which we are seeing new supply chains to furnish the technologies that are required by a renewable or at least a zero emissions energy system. We're also seeing technological developments in the fields of adaptation or of decarbonizing of materials, like green steel, so-called, right? So for me, what's important is the quite material building of productive capacities, of supply chains, but also of research and development, and in some cases quite speculative ideas about how how a certain technology can mitigate already existing climate change, right? So when I talk about green capitalism, it is kind of a mix of productive forces that are already being installed and deployed to produce certain products that at least are justified because they have some role in greening the economy, right? Whether that's a lithium battery or a lower carbon steel. But also, and this is where I think the critical valence is important to retain, unproven technologies, right? Technologies where the firms that make them or the governments that promote them can claim that they will help us solve the climate crisis, and so geoengineering or carbon capture. But I think it's good to think about all of these together, because at the sectoral level, at the investment level, and in the arena of political contention and policymaking, they are in the same sort of group, right? And so, I guess that, unlike those kind of other definitions, I focus more on, materially what is happening with capitalism, right? One of, I think, there's like kind of two other elements that you brought in that I think help us specify the current conjuncture of green capitalism. One is this kind of the geopolitical aspect, and the other is like this kind of deeper issue too of capital accumulation and profitability, right? And so I'm going to end up connecting those a bit, but I want to treat them separately to start with, right? And because your question also disambiguated them. So in this moment of escalated geopolitical tensions, that's exactly the moment in which onshoring has become like a favorite tactic on the part of states. They have promoted onshoring in part by, as I said, kind of stitching together a coalition that can include climate activists, include like industrial policy advocates, can include national security hawks that are concerned about China, right? And so onshoring is a way to kind of assert geopolitical prowess while also building this green capitalist economy. It is quite, in some ways, auspicious and felicitous for green capitalism, this onshoring argument, because in reality, what it amounts to is tax breaks and subsidies and financial underwriting and backstopping for the operations of green capital. Because once the mining of lithium or the factories of lithium batteries are seen as like geostrategically important, the floodgates of state support open, right? So in this way, the security discourses are, which might be in some ways perhaps, I'll revisit this in a moment, perhaps like circumstantial or unrelated to the inner workings of capitalism, but they can definitely help promote the interests of capitalists, right? And that's why they're in this coalition. I think two questions follow from that you yourself have pointed to. One is, if we onshore all this mining in the global north, does that change our view of the global economy, in which, like, it used to be that mainly extraction come from peripheries, and, so that's one of your questions. The other one of your questions is it really so copacetic between these multinational corporations with these relatively dispersed supply chains and this kind of security interest in onshoring? Like, is there a limit to how much those two factions can get along, right? Or see themselves as part of a shared political project, right? And so for the first, I think it's very important, and I often have to like doubly or triply emphasize this lest I be mistaken. I am not at all arguing, or let alone like observing, that there is a movement of mining from the global south to the global north. Instead, it's an expansion, right? We can almost stick with that idea of energy addition, or like an all of the above, or like this multiplicity and multiplication of extractive regimes and the multiplication of extractive frontiers, to kind of apprehend the fact that you can have more mining in the global north and more mining in the global south. As long as demand is growing, there is no contradiction there, right? And you can actually potentially develop even more inequalities. I'm not quite sure we see that yet, but we could imagine a situation in which the regulatory regimes governing extraction in the north and south diverge. This is not, I don't fully think this is the case right now, so I want to be clear about that, but just as a thought experiment, right? Like, what if we got much better environmental regulation of mining in the global north than in the global south? Let's just say that were happening. Then not only would we continue with unequal exchange, because there's still mining in the global south, that's still really routed towards global north economies, and plus there's more mining in the global north, but also the global south mining is like even more environmentally harmful. So we're actually like basically increasing the kind of gap of unequal ecological exchange and economic exchange, right? So that's just a thought experiment for now, but because mining is still pretty toxic in the global north too, right? So I don't want to say it's clean in the global north, though that's part of the discourse, right? But it's just to say that you can expand extraction inside the global north without necessarily fundamentally changing south-north relations. However, I do think it has knock-on effects and implications politically, economically, and ecologically to have more mining in the global north, right? It certainly brings the consequences of our supply chains, of our modes of production and consumption a little closer to home, right? Who they actually affect and whether your average consumer or more affluent consumer of some of these products, whether it's a Tesla or a solar panel, really encounters mining, even if it's in the US, that's a separate question. And that, I think, important. And so the last thing I'll say on this point is that for me, what has been very enlightening about grappling with mining for green technologies in the global north is that it's revealed to me how fractal the relationships are of core and periphery, right? That we actually should not be satisfied with a sort of methodological nationalism in which entire countries are labeled one way and other entire countries are labeled another. Because what that obscures is the fact that within the global north, there are hinterlands, there are rural peripheries, there are extractive frontiers that at certain moments state actors have found it strategic to have within their own borders, right? Just the same as in the global south. There's class inequality. There are people that benefit more from that regime of extractivism than the people that pay the ecological price for it, right? So I think that it behooves us to think in terms of scales or in terms of fractal patterns, and the fact that when mining is brought onshore into the U.S., the people and places it affects are people and places that bear some resemblance to the colonized and then neo-colonized kind of subjects in the global south, meaning they're indigenous peoples, they are people that are, considered more sacrificable because of their rural kind of land-based or place-based kind of livelihoods. They are, there's a lot of ecological sacrifice, right? And so it can kind of show us across the global divide of North and South these kind of resonances and echoes, right? Without flattening the world into some kind of flat space, right? The second thing I want to get to, and this will kind of wrap my thoughts on this matter, is how much can the national security hawkishness and the anti-China and the supply chain security stuff that motivates this onshoring, how much can that stay in a kind of happy alliance with ultimately transnational capital, right? And there's a lot of benefits slushing around that kind of enable that alliance. As I said, the kind of fact that in reality, this is a very corporate-friendly set of policies, because the way you attract capitalists to do things is by, financial sweeteners and carrots more than sticks and whatever, right? So, that helps soften any potential tensions, but the tensions are still there. And I maybe want to bring in something that I don't have a firm opinion on, but I think it would be interesting for viewers to kind of think about a little bit, which is why are we in such a moment of geoeconomics, of a moment where economic policies and economic processes are being seen through the lens of national security, where a decade ago it was fine to just get copper on global markets and import it from Chile, no problem. We pay a cheap price, it's pretty reliable. And now it's maybe we need that copper in the US. Why are we in a moment where it seems like capitalism is being reshaped according to geopolitical directives? And that, I think, entails a deeper question that can implicate capitalism itself, right? So I think there's a way in which I initially sketched them where these are almost external facts to one another, right? On the one hand, you have these state actors who are geopolitically driven. On the other hand, you have transnational capital or globalist capital that might like benefiting from those security policies, but ultimately would also prefer to maintain global supply chains and the ability to partner with countries around the world or investors around the world, right? But, some interesting thinkers, I'm thinking of Jamie Merchant, Jack Copley, some interesting Ialis Amani, correct me if I'm saying anyone's name wrong, have gotten to this kind of understanding where the geopolitics are themselves a result of a contradiction in capitalism, right? So that kind of, rather than an external contradiction, it's an immanent contradiction within capitalism, right? I'm not saying if I fully subscribe to this argument, but I find it very thought-provoking. And the basics are that capital globally has been entering into, over the past decades, a situation of terminal secular stagnation. Due to problems of overcapacity, right? They're drawing a lot on Robert Brenner's work, et cetera. Yeah. Exactly. there's a little difficulty with how you fully assimilate China into this narrative. They have ways of assimilating China, but it obviously goes against the grain of secular stagnation since it boomed and rose during the period of most pronounced secular stagnation in the West. But we'll put that aside, and I know and I acknowledge that there's ways to kind of incorporate China into this narrative as well. But regardless, in a case in which capitalists themselves begin to see limits to profitability, what in the 70s, in the famous title, were called limits to growth, right? In terms of the ecological, limits, right? Limits because of this secular decline in which there's a shrinking pie, or at least a more static pie, that capitals, we can get into the idea of national capitals, are kind of competing over what is a kind of stagnating amount of total profitability kind of opportunities. In such
zero-sum game.
Exactly. I was just literally about to say that. In such a zero-sum domain, game theory tells us that actors start to behave differently, right? The constraints become more intense. You start to use tactics that are alive to those constraints rather than assuming infinite growth, right? And so part of what's emerging in this moment is that states are enabling capital accumulation by subsidizing it, and also by kind of buttressing in a mercantilist vein the competition, the antagonistic competition between capitals headquartered in different great powers with one another, right? And so in a way, what all this neo-mercantilism, this protectionism, this geoeconomics speaks to is kind of increasingly apparent constraints on capital accumulation itself. In which case, sure, there might be fights between different political actors, between the most hawkish versions of this coalition, or kind of elements of this coalition, and the most transnational capital-aligned elements of this coalition. But at the end of the day, from this perspective, they actually issue from the same, set of contradictions in capitalism itself, right? So that's a way to kind of view them as connected rather than externally in confrontation. However, I think that, we're all political actors, meaning, that it is a theory that is compelling, but on the day-to-day of politics and of political fights, political antagonisms, the terrain of politics, the terrain of the state, these elements do enter into tension with one another, right? And so I think it's important on the left to not totally smooth that out, and to instead think about, whether we're thinking just intellectually from the perspective of critique or politically from the perspective of action and intervention and protagonism. Are those tensions, even if, again, this orientation of a kind of geoeconomic capitalism issues from this kind of shared dilemma, there are tensions between different state and capital actors of how to deal with that fact, and those tensions can give us critical analytic leverage on the system writ large, and they can also potentially orient us to political openings, right? Because I think, especially in a moment in many countries in the so-called West of political marginalization of the left or some political defeat, one of the openings that we have to look for is fractures and fragmentation among elite actors. That might be a precondition for us to situate ourselves so that we can gain some political protagonism in this moment, right? So I think there's a strategic reason on the left to not erase or flatten or explain away some of the tensions that are clearly there, at least on the level of kind of daily politics. And maybe, one last thing I want to say is that, to kind of maybe tie a bow on this a little bit, is that if, according to some of the scholars that I've named, this whole geoeconomic turn and onshoring as a specific tactic of that, if that itself issues from a crisis of profitability of capitalism, then there's a question, which is it solving that crisis? And that is a very open question, which I think actually redounds to, or sort of underscores the utility of that analysis of crisis of profitability. Because if the crisis is as deep as some of those thinkers that I said say, then it's actually maybe not surprising that these geoeconomic strategies are not fully solving it, or they're a temporary band-aid, or they're a provisional settlement, rather than fully solving the crisis, right? And, there's just so many examples of that, and Brett Christopher's work is among that, has alerted me to this quite a bit, but, and as well as the work of some others, that not only, there's this kind of broader issue of capital accumulation, but specifically actually in green sectors, whether those are renewable electricity markets or some of the mining sectors associated with these supply chains, or solar panels, or green steel, right? All of these have faced some pretty fundamental profitability questions, precisely and especially in the sort of Western polities that are trying to prop them up through these neo-mercantilist protectionist means. But after quite a bit of financial backstopping on the part of the EU, Northvolt, the Swedish battery maker, is bankrupt, right? And then what's amazing, and I just want to end it here, the news just in the news today, on the day that we're recording this, is that bankruptcy, but also the EU deciding to get more stringent about investment policies and foreign direct investment, which is specifically aimed at China. So what I'm saying is that on the one hand, the vaunted European experiment in battery self-sufficiency, right, and sort of self-powered, pun intended, kind of green economy, with tremendous financial underwriting by the EU and by European companies as purchasers initially, like BMW, and them pulling out was part of what created this crisis, among other things, right? The failure and the bankruptcy, literally and figuratively, of that kind of project is then side by side by, instead of the EU, for example, saying, well, okay, our bid to have a Swedish battery and a kind of European supply chain didn't totally work. Let's just go back to Chinese investment, to joint ventures with Chinese and South Korean companies, which already provision 60% of European batteries, right? So that route seems better. Maybe we should do tech transfer. Maybe we should invite more of this FDI under our own terms, sure, but not shy away from it or not prohibit it. And instead, we have the opposite, which is a doubling down on securitized rules of investment, in which case there are serious questions raised about how we're going to get a green economy in Europe, because apparently it's not Northvolt, nor is it BYD, right? At least in terms of what politicians are currently orienting towards. And that raises not only questions about industrial policy and political economy, but questions about decarbonizing Europe, which is supposedly what initially was driving all of this, right? And so we see how security and sustainability, they can be joined as a powerful discursive and policy apparatus, but they can also enter into real tension with one another.
Especially also because most recently in Europe, in the German weapons producer Rheinmetall just announced that they would be able to take over the idle capacity of Volkswagen. So
fascinating.
Instead of decarbonizing or reducing car dependency, or growing the EV park of Europe, we might see a sort of war Keynesianism fueled by
100%. Yeah. And the road to that was partly paved with these green discourses of onshoring and supply chains. And it's very interesting to think through how easily that gets militarized, or how easily this stuff gets redirected towards, it's actually a military goal now, or a security goal, or a rearmament goal, rather than a climate goal. But it's the same policies. And we see the policies can really serve quite different ends. And that raises a question of whether some of us, maybe not me, but people who I respect and worked with, were a little too sanguine about the conjoining of security discourses and sustainability discourses. Or, yeah. I mean, at the very least, we need to be alert at which of those forces is going to win out when there is a tension between them.